Hello everyone, it's Tuesday and you're watching Within the Frame, where we delve deeper into the top stories not only in South Korea but across the globe. I'm Kim Bo-kyung. On February 4th, the U.S. military shot down a suspected Chinese spy balloon that had been floating across the country for several days. After that, 3 more unidentified objects have been brought down, though not yet characterized specifically yet. China, meanwhile, seemed to at first play the spy balloon incident down by saying it was a civilian airship that drifted astray by accident. Yet as the tension ratchets up, China is now countering the U.S. quite more vociferously by saying that Washington flew spy balloons into Chinese airspace more than 10 times since January last year without Beijing's permission. How is the tension between Washington and Beijing going to unfold? And how is this strained relationship going to affect the rest of the world, including South Korea? For an in-depth analysis of strained relationship between the U.S. and China, we invited Choi Hyun-jin, Associate Professor at Kyung University, into the studio. Professor Choi, welcome to the show.
Good evening, Bo-kyung.
All right, and we also have Professor Oh Jun-seok, Business School Dean at Sookmyang Women's University, joining live through Skype. Professor Oh, welcome and thank you for your time.
Thank you for inviting me.
All right, first question to you, Professor Choi. The U.S. military has shut down 3 more unidentified objects since the Chinese spy balloon was brought down on February 4th. Now, this alarmed Americans very much, and a growing number of lawmakers are calling for more information to be unveiled. I wonder, how is this incident being viewed by the U.S. right now?
As you mentioned, the balloon incidents caused outrage in Washington, especially among Republican politicians. And they criticized the U.S. military and also U.S. President Joe Biden for not shooting it down sooner when it first entered American airspace. President Biden also mentioned the balloon incident in his State of the Union speech last week. And he said that he would cooperate with China, but he made it clear that he will protect America if China threatens its sovereignty. The U.S. Congress, just like Korea, is deeply divided nowadays. But the spy balloon was one of the few bipartisan issues in the U.S. Congress.
Right. Professor Choi, one more question. At first, it seemed like China was trying to play the incident down by saying that it was just a civilian airship. But now it is countering U.S. claims, saying the United States flew spy balloons into Chinese airspace more than 10 times since January last year, without Beijing's permission, of course. Why such a change in China's tone?
Initially, the China's foreign ministry reacted somewhat angrily to Washington, saying that the balloon was simply a civilian research craft and accused Washington of hypocrisy. The China also declined a U.S. request for a phone call between defense ministers of both countries. But I think there is still a chance for re-engagement in the near future. The China is controlling social media to somehow downplay this incident that embarrasses China and also antagonize America. The China also wants to revive its own economy after the crushing zero COVID policy in the past years. And for this, the Beijing needs to restore its broken relation with Washington. The China's top diplomat Wang Yi is going to visit Germany this weekend to attend the Munich Security Conference. And I guess he wants to meet with the U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken there to restore diplomacy between the two nations.
Right, so China is going to try to recover the relationship with the United States.
Yes, I think so.
Right. Now, Professor Oh, the U.S. Commerce Department announced on Friday new sanctions targeting 6 Chinese aerospace companies that reportedly supported the nation's balloon program. What does this imply?
In brief, there are 2 respects. As for international trade, it will elevate the level of U.S.-China trade tension in the spectrum of critical supply chain reformation. And as for industries, a trade war is moving on to the tech war and eventually highly likely triggering harmful competition of investment promotion between the 2 countries. Balloons should have been just balloons. If not, a U.S. fighter jet shot down them, heightened concern over China's surveillance program and public pressure on Biden to take a tough stand against it. And the USS blacklisted 6 Chinese entities, it says. They were linked to Beijing's aerospace programs. The economic restrictions announced and that followed the Biden administration, to consider broader effort to address Chinese surveillance activities and will make it more difficult to obtain American technology experts. 6 entities were being targeted for their support for China's military modernization efforts, and the People's Liberation Army is utilizing high-altitude balloon for intelligence. Implication? Biden administration got a license to kill the Chinese tech chain and will end up with supply chain disruption. They will not hesitate to use such restrictions and other regulatory and enforcement tools to protect the U.S. National security and sovereignty. As Korea is an export-driven economy, this is why I'm very worried about the contraction of the global market, trade market. I'd like to add one more comment to let you catch this occasion. According to the Prime Minister Trudeau, when the unidentified object shot down over Canada, Trudeau says Chinese spy balloon, we think people we shoot. I suppose they must have thought before they blow.
Right, interesting. Now, Professor Che, the U.S. said on Wednesday, that Chinese surveillance balloons have been spotted across at least 5 continents over the past several years, and that Washington had been in contact with the allies to share this information, saying that U.S. is not the only target of China's balloon, program. What is the diplomatic reason behind Washington's such disclosure?
First of all, the surveillance activities by balloon, satellite, or aircraft are widespread around the world. And the amount of intelligence gathering by every country is overwhelming nowadays. Therefore, China's surveillance program across 5 continents, for me, is neither surprising nor uncommon. What is more important, as you just said, is diplomatic reason behind such Washington's move. And recently, the competition between the United States and China are becoming more intense. And the war in Ukraine is also sharpening this confrontation between the 2 countries. And therefore, some scholars call this situation a new Cold War. And therefore, both the US and China have tried to strengthen the solidarity and cooperation with their own allies and like-minded countries in the Indo-Pacific region. So therefore, the Washington's disclosure of China's surveillance program could be understood in this context of a growing strategic rivalry between the 2 countries. So let's go back to your original question. So what is the diplomatic reason behind such Washington's disclosure? I think it is to unite allies and partners under U.S. leadership.
Right, so it's trying to strengthen the alliance with other countries right now. Right. Professor O, the U.S. is reportedly going to curb investment in Chinese tech companies by U.S. firms in a way by requiring to provide more information to the government on planned investments in areas such as quantum computing and artificial intelligence and so on. How is this going to affect China's development or growth in such areas, in such advanced technology areas?
No wonder negative effect will be prolonged. Economics tells what is certain is international cooperation is always better than international competition. That is because a trade competition between U.S. and China is painstaking game, while trade cooperation like FTA, RCEP, or USMCA a painstaking game. Bunch of theories speak out. Trade promotion is far better than trade blocking. I perfectly agree with Professor Che because it's a matter of hegemony. In spite of this, a trade war turns into tech war, fought with weaponized technologies or strategic items. When chip industry first developed in the 1960s, it was located almost entirely in the United States. The United States got a full governance over its industry around the world. But over the last 5 decades, as chip grew more complex, China is investing billions in chip production in pursuit of a global supply chain. Countries began to specialize in separate parts of chip making processes bound for the final destination of manufacturing in China. Now, China got the power. Global industries during the pandemic experienced the supply chain disruption due to China's sudden lockdown. They came to know risk resilience and risk insulation by way of supply chain reformation. What a good timing for the new game. This is why the Biden administration is moving to trade blocking to deal with high-tech sectors like quantum engineering and, as you mentioned, the AI. The CHIPS and Science Act will provide $52 billion in support for semiconductor companies to build high-end chip fabrication plant in the United States. In this perspective, it is expected so-called China's manufacturing exodus start to move forward, even though there is a strong edge of manufacturing in China.
Right, so strong impact, negative impact that is on China. Right, Professor Che, the U.S. is reportedly reaching out to other countries as well, such as European Union, to ensure that they do not provide similar financing or funding after Washington cuts down its investment ties with China. Now, what does this mean?
The essence of a rivalry between the United States and China lies in competition for advanced technology, such as semiconductors and quantum computing. And the U.S. wants to prevent China from challenging its position in the Indo-Pacific region. And the most effective means to achieve this goal is to block China from acquiring such technologies. And for example, there's Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, or IPEF, and this forum could be a new Asia-Pacific economic bloc that excludes China. And this IPF aims to build stable supply chain for semiconductors and core material centered on the United States, not China.
Right. Oh, now, Professor O, on the back of this spy balloon incident, chances are that the U.S. isn't going to lose enough export or investment controls on China. The problem is that this affects South Korea as well, like you have already mentioned. South Korean chip makers are reportedly requesting a waiver or a grace period from the rule. But how would South Korea's chip industry be affected if they do not get an exemption? And what would happen if the U.S. implements tougher rules in the future?
It will make a situation of harmful competition of investment promotion. It seems like prove yourself, you are my alliance by way of investment other than market mechanism. Because semiconductors accounts for about 20% of Korean export, home to Samsung Electronics and SK Hynix. Korea will be stuck in the middle. Outbound shipments of memory chips, a key export item, inched up 1% on year in 2022 to a record high of $129.23 billion US dollars. Both Samsung and SK Hynix must take into account the geopolitical reality and the increasing cost of U.S. chips manufacturing factories, putting them under more difficult circumstances. The ties between China and Korea have come under immense strain as Korean government consider joining the prospective alliance, while memory chip giants such as Samsung Electronics and SK Hynix fear that its chip making base in China might be affected by chip war alliance. Considering 30% of memory chip exports goes to China, the retaliation will be hit hardly if they become a reality. On the other hand, come to think of it, given that 70% of Chinese chip imports are from Korea, retaliation against Korea's chip-making industry is very unlikely. Instead, according to smooth out the tariff war situation, there is a possibility of a chain retaliation against each other, Korea against China, China against Korea, Korea's other industries or Korea's advanced material industry crucial for the chip supply chain.
Right, interesting. Now, Professor Che, the sky balloon incident created a relationship between China and the U.S. already, prompting Secretary of State Antony Blinken to cancel his planned trip to Beijing. And of course, like you said, the top diplomats are weighing the meeting to take place at the Munich. Right? But some say that it's believed that the tension is not going to simmer down that easily. Should we say the relationship between the U.S. and China will remain somewhat strained? Or, like you said, why, if it has to be restored, why is it so?
I believe they will eventually resolve the dispute through diplomacy. And as you said, the Blinken didn't visit Beijing, but I think he was postponing, not canceling his visit. And also in his State of the Union address, the President Biden mentioned about the spy balloon incident in a just single line. So this suggests that the Biden also wants to contain the spillover from this incident. And as I said earlier, there is a growing geopolitical rivalry between the two nations nowadays, but they are also deeply interconnected economically. So in the wake of this diplomatic trouble, surrounding spy balloons, surprisingly, the trade volume between the U.S. and China set a new record last year. So thus, they have strong reasons to manage their disagreements, and therefore, the question is now when they find their way back to the negotiating table. And this could be the Munich Security Council Security Conference later this week, or the Blinken could meet with Wang Yi at the G20 foreign ministers meeting in India next month.
Right. So for now, they seem very angry at each other, but eventually they would have to, patch things up because they're very much interdependent to each other. Right. Now, Professor O, according to the Bank of Korea, if tensions between China and the U.S. remain strained, if so, disruptions to the global supply chain would not just affect the chip industry, but the South Korean economy overall. Now, how will it affect South Korea's economy and the global economy as well?
The Korean economy faces nowadays multiple worries aside from financial volatility due to high inflation and then foreign exchange market exchange vulnerability. Economic slowdown in China, the largest trade partner of Korea, and the U.S., the second largest trade partner. When the tech war between the United States and China is prolonged, Korea will face a drastic drop of trade volume in terms of production base and market base altogether. As for international politics, the existing spectrum of national security, which mainly focusing on tech security, is gradually expanding to new areas, including economy, food security, environmental matters, and social factors, which are all trade barriers. Global supply chain that has been driving the growth of digital economy. With the expansion of globalization is becoming an unstable factor that can weaken and worsen national competitiveness through the weaponizing of its interdependence. In this respect, Korean government must closely monitor and supervise the risk factors linked with China-U.S. trade war. In the meanwhile, Korean economy itself making every effort for building up private sector innovations. Textbook conclusion always tells promoting investment and then virtuous cycle of growth will be the key to get out of this trap.
Right, advice from our Professor O. Now, Professor Che, I'd like to also tap on the North Korean issue as well. Experts say that the spy balloon saga could adversely affect the peninsula issue, negating Beijing's role in resolving North Korea's nuclear issue. Now, what is your take on this, and how should South Korea play in this kind of situation?
So many issues, including North Korean nuclear crisis, are no longer free from U.S.-China rivalry structure.
Right.
And therefore, North Korean denuclearization is South Korea's vital national interest. However, it is likely to be somewhat downgraded to the next level and discussed in the context of competition between the U.S. and China, which is like a black hole that overwhelms all other variables. The Biden administration's National Security Strategy report last year also briefly mentioned North Korea, and therefore diplomacy is very important for South Korea. So we have to do our best to put the North Korean issue back to the top of the international agenda.
Right, so South Korea would have to put more diplomatic efforts to solve the issue. All right, unfortunately, this is all the time we have for today's edition, but thank you, Professor Che, for your insight. And of course, thank you, Professor Oh, for your insight as well. We really appreciate them. All right, that's all for Within the Frame tonight. We will be back tomorrow with more in-depth stories. Thank you for watching and goodbye.